Hello everyone, and welcome to our lecture for week 7. Today we're going to cover chapters 12 and 14. We're going to be looking at identifying efficient liability rules and the effect of risk aversion and consumer care on these rules. To start with, we're going to look at competitive markets in chapter 12. This chapter is useful for at least one of the questions in your second assignment, and it defines what competitive markets are. So basically it says that a competitive market is a market in which there are many firms producing the same commodity and many purchasing it. So you have many buyers and many sellers, and they are producing something that they can't actually compete on in relation to distinguishing or differentiating the product itself. So like a commodity. Okay. So producers, consumers have no control over the price, and there are no barriers for firms to enter or exit the market, at least in the long run. So there are no barriers to enter and exit, and the long run equilibrium is then given as price equal cost of production. Okay. So in such a market, firms will break even. Breaking even, of course, doesn't mean that you can't pay salaries and so on. There's look at the first paragraph on page 105 to explain what that actually means to be to break even. All right. So we come up with a principle that says if markets take all relevant costs in terms of cost of production into account, then a market such as a competitive market will lead to the efficient outcome. So when the price is equal to the cost of production and the cost of production allocates all relevant costs, we have an efficient outcome. And there's an example in your textbook about a lawnmower, and it explains why this is an efficient outcome. All right, let's then move to chapter 14 on product liability. We're gonna again go back and look at the alternative liability rules, so things like strict liability, negligence, and no liability, and try to figure out which one of these would be the best design for a legal system under certain assumptions. Let's start as usual with an example. Today we're going to look at a manufacturer that needs to decide whether to use bottles or cans for their soda. The bottles are cheaper but have higher accident costs, and we're going to assume that the purchaser is the victim, and later on we're going to relax this assumption and say that there are third parties as well. And we're going to also assume that the purchaser cannot take precautions, which will also relax later on in this lecture. We'll assume as well as that both producers and consumers are risk averse, and as usual that will also be relaxed and looking where we look at when at least one or both are risk averse. So this is our payoffs table for this example. So the firm has an option or a choice, a decision to make whether to use a bottle or a can. If they choose to use a bottle, then the cost of production per unit is $1, and there's a probability of accident to the consumer given as 1 over 100,000, and the loss if there's an accident is 10,000. And as you'd know by now that we're looking at risk neutral agents, so the expected accident cost is simply multiplication of 2 and 3. So 2 times 3 would give you 10 cents for the bottles, and hence the full cost per the unit is the cost of production plus the expected accident loss. Of course, this depends on whether you can actually you have enough information to be able to ascertain this expected accident loss, so you are not underestimating, for example, the risk of this product, but also because you are the victim, so you want to add this to your cost when you look at whether you want to purchase a bottle or a can, in particular if the liability rule says that you will be responsible for your own losses, right? Okay, so based on this we look at the last column then, column 5, and we see that the cans are less expensive, or they cost less. This is the cost of the production and the expected accident loss. So this would say to us that more likely than not the consumers are gonna choose these cans. Okay, again depending on the assumptions that we make. And there are further explanations in the paragraph just under the table on page 114 for you to look at as to why cans are the more efficient outcome. Okay, let's then now assume that we have perfect information, so we are able actually to ascertain the cost of accidents plus of course the production costs. And this is pretty much assuming similar to what we assumed under the cost theorem, that there is no zero transaction costs. So let's look at the three liability rules. The first one we're going to look at is strict liability. Here the firm is liable whenever the accident occurs, and the expected accident loss is lower for cans, so you can go back and check it on page 114. You find that the cans expected loss is only 2 cents compared to 10 cents. This is column 4, compared to 10 cents for the bottles. Okay, but consumers also prefer the lower price of cans, so when you add everything together, so you'd find that strict liability then is efficient. Why is it efficient? Because it leads to the efficient outcome. Just like we did in previous chapters, this slide here, this table gives us the efficient outcome based on the costs. So we see that the cans, so the net benefits basically, we see that the cans are the more efficient outcome. Now we want to see if we choose strict liability, would that also give us the signal that we need to use the cans? And we're saying that that's exactly correct, because the expected accident loss when there is strict liability, who's going to pay for this? Is the liability of the firm to pay. So if they are the ones making the decision to use either the cans or the bottles, they're going to look at where is the lower cost. So you'd find that the lower cost for the accident itself is for the cans, but also the overall cost, which is what the consumer is going to see as well, is for the cans. So the firm would choose the cans because that would reduce their costs under strict liability, because they would be liable for whatever happens if an accident occurs. So they would rather take the 2 cents that they have to pay under the cans rather than the 10 cents under the bottles. What about negligence then? Here we'd assume again that negligence of course has a standard of care, so we're going to put the standard of care again as always where the efficient outcome is. So firms will be liable only if they use bottles, because if you use cans, that's the efficient outcome, so we'll allow that to happen. But we don't want them to go to bottles, so we'll say that if they choose to use bottles, then they would be negligent, so they are liable only if they use these bottles. Okay, so now when you look at it as a consumer, as the person who's going to buy the bottle, that's going to say, okay, now the price of the can itself is 103. So we go back and look at it in column 1. You see that the cost of production is 103 for the can, but now you know that you as the consumer will be responsible for the accident, so you'll factor that into, and you can't take any precautions for now. We'll assume that you can't take any precautions, so you're going to factor that into the price that you're going to pay for the can. That gives you a 105, but it's still less than that of the bottle price. So the bottle price, of course, where the firms would be liable, not you. So that would give you still again the same signal that you would rather buy the cans rather than buy the bottles, which means that negligence is also efficient under these assumptions. Consumer has perfect information. What about no liability then? What about where the firm has no liability whatsoever? The consumer has to bear all the losses. Okay. Now again, as before, the consumer, because they're going to pay for the expected cost of the accident, they factor that into the cost of production of the bottles, because that's what they're going to pay. So now they're going to look at $1.10 for the bottle and $1.05 for the cans. Again, they choose the cans, so again there's no under no liability, you'll find that you get the same efficient outcome, which means that under all three liability rules, you'll find that you get the exact same efficient outcome of purchasing and producing the cans. So when producers, consumers are risk averse, that's our general rule. When producers, consumers are risk neutral, and consumers have perfect information about the product, the risks of the product, the choice of a liability rule is irrelevant. The choice is irrelevant. All rules will give you the same efficient outcome. You've seen this before. This is simply another application of the cost theorem. So it says it doesn't matter which rule you choose or how you design the legal system. you will always get the same outcome, the efficient outcome. Again, we're assuming here that this is a frictionless basically world, so regardless of which rule you choose, you will always end up at the efficient outcome, in this case using the cans and producing the cans. However, of course, now we're going to start relaxing some of these assumptions, and you will see how the rules, the outcome under each rule will change. So let's assume first that we don't have perfect information. So let's assume that consumers are going to underestimate product risks. Previously, they knew exactly what the cost of the accident was. Here, we don't have that information. Okay. So assume consumers believe that the product is safe, so they are going to underestimate the risk. Under strict liability, okay, you're not affected because consumers are compensated for losses. If the firm is the one who's going to pay for the costs, it doesn't matter if the consumer underestimates or not. The firm would be able to ascertain the costs. So here the perception of the consumer doesn't really affect what happens under strict liability, and the firms will still choose to produce or put their soda in cans rather than bottles, which is exactly what we want. That's the efficient outcome. What about negligence now? Again, assume that firms will be liable only if they bottle their sodas. So now, because of imperfect information, consumers will not add the cost of the accident when they make their decision whether they want to have a can or a bottle. They think cans are safe. So the 2 cents that we know would cost the consumer because under negligence, that's what the consumer will have to pay. The 2 cents under the cans option will not be visible basically to the consumer. Okay, but still they will buy the cans because they are still cheaper than the bottles. Okay. However, now there's the problem that they would choose to use or consume too much soda, okay, because they don't understand the risk of using the cans. Okay, so the discussion of that is on page 117. So negligence in that sense would be inefficient with respect to consumer decisions, not the decisions of the firms to use the cans or not, but the consumer's decision of how much soda to consume. All right. Under no liability, now the firm has no liability for the accidents regardless. So the prices of bottles, again, this is the production price. The production cost is $1 for the bottle and $1.03 for the cans, but the consumers will not add the cost of accidents to either one of these because they don't have that information, because now they're assuming that the products are safe, whether it's the bottle or the can. But now, because they have taken out the 2 cents and the 10 cents that we've added in column 5, and they're looking only at column 1, so you can also look at that on page 114, table 14. Now they see that the bottles are cheaper, so now they actually want to buy bottles, not buy cans, and that means that they're going to go with an inefficient consumer decision. So they don't go for the cans, which is the efficient outcome. Again, the general rule here, when consumers underestimate the risk, there's a problem with information, there's imperfect information. Only strict liability is efficient with respect to both the care exercised by firms and the purchase decisions by consumers. So here strict liability would act basically as a substitute for perfect information, and that would be, under this assumption, the preferred design that we would choose for our legal system or for the remedies or the liability rules in the system. All right. Let's now relax another assumption. Now let's assume that at least one of the parties here, either the producers or the consumers, is risk averse. Let's say that the producers bear risk under strict liability. So we know that. And consumers bear risk under negligence and no liability. So we know that producers would be the ones that bear the risk under strict liability, and we know that the consumers would bear the risk under negligence and no liability. How would that then be impacted by our assumption of risk aversion? Okay, so negligence is equal to no liability with respect to risk allocation. Okay, so this is just to simplify our coming analysis, because we know that negligence is equal in terms of the bearing of risk for consumers. So regardless of whether you choose negligence or no liability, the consumer will always be the one to bear the risk there. Okay, so that's what we mean, that it's equal to no liability with respect to risk allocation in terms looking at the consumers. But negligence is preferred because it forces firms to take care, because under no liability the firms or the producers are not liable regardless, but under negligence they're at least liable if they choose bottles, right? So it's negligence will always be preferred to no liability. So in that sense, we don't want to waste time still looking at no liability, and we'll focus only on two liability rules, the strict liability rule and negligence rule. So let's assume now that there's insurance. So the full analysis we looked at earlier in chapter 9 is also relevant here, but there are some nuances. So if there's no insurance, okay, let's say there's no insurance, what happens? Should we take strict liability or negligence? As we said, no liability is not going to be considered because negligence will always be better than that option. Strict liability would be ideal where what? Where the producers are risk neutral, because strict liability says what? They are the ones that are going to bear the risk under strict liability. Yes. So as we said previous chapter in the previous slide, producers bear the risk under strict liability. If they are risk neutral, then that's not an issue for them because they would be happy to bear that risk. However, if it's the consumers that are risk neutral, then it's negligence that would be the ideal rule to use. Okay, so assuming here in the first instance that producers are risk neutral and consumers are risk averse, so strict liability would be ideal. If you reverse the situation, then negligence would be the ideal rule if the consumers are the ones that are risk averse and the producers are if the consumers are risk neutral and the producers are risk averse. So we're not going to talk much about if let's focus. So let's talk a little bit about no insurance. Then of course we'll add to that third party and ideal insurance. So where both producers and consumers are risk averse, so now we have both of them not willing to assume the risk. What do you do? So now we use a modified version of strict liability, meaning what? So now the liability is a function of relative risk aversion. So we're saying although both producers and consumers are risk averse, some of them, so maybe the producers would be more risk averse than the consumers, or the consumers would be more risk averse than the producers, which means that when we use the strict liability rule, we will have to apportion the risk allocation based on that relativity in the risk aversion. Okay, so the more risk averse consumers are, the higher should be the level of liability, because you don't want them to have the liability because they are more risk averse. So you shift that risk to the producers, who are of course going to be the ones liable under a strict liability rule. But this is now a modified rule. It's a sliding ruler, so you would allocate the risk between the two depending on the relativities of their risk aversion. Now this is now if ideal insurance and first party insurance are available, then you'd say that both of these rules, strict liability and negligence, are efficient in terms of risk allocation, because now you can insure the party that is basically risk averse. However, there's, as before, the problem of moral hazard. So under strict liability, producers still bear some risk because the insurance is incomplete because of this idea of moral hazard. So you remember what we said about moral hazard, the idea that you can't monitor the performance, monitor the behavior of the insured party after insurance or the contract has been signed. So you'll have to have incomplete insurance, in the sense that you can't monitor their behavior completely. Under negligence, then, consumers bear some of the risk because the first party insurance is also incomplete. So moral hazard simply means that even though you are insured, you would have to pay something like an excess at the beginning in order for the insurance company to make sure that you don't change your behavior and you become careless, because you are already covered for your behavior, for your reckless behavior. Alright. Further explanations are also on pages 119 and 120. So now the optimal choice, again, whether it's going to be strict liability or negligence, depends on the relativities of the risk allocation between the producers and the consumers. Now let's also relax one more of the assumptions that we made earlier, and we say that consumers now can actually take care. They can actually affect the outcome or the expected costs of the accidents. So we said the 10 cents under the bottles and the 2 cents under the cans. So now we remove the earlier assumption that consumers cannot change their expected losses by taking care, and this is similar to what we said also in chapter 6. Here now in chapter 14, under strict liability, to induce consumers to take care, we need, as before, to introduce contributory negligence. Okay, but this is not ideal if consumers underestimate the probability or magnitude of the harm, because now they wouldn't actually take into account that there would be contributory. There would also be found negligence, which would reduce at least their damages under strict liability, or previously, of course, under common law, that would actually eliminate their damages altogether. But this basically means that the producers have no incentive now to take care, because they know that consumers are not going to take care, and they will be found liable under contributory negligence. All right. What about under negligence? Again, not ideal, because consumers underestimate the probability or magnitude of the harm. So we're talking about consumers can take care, but they are likely to underestimate. And if they underestimate the liability, they would not purchase insurance because they think that the product is safe. So the general rule then, when consumers can take care but they underestimate losses, so this is the assumption we're making still, that the information is not perfect. So we have the assumption that we relax the assumption that we have perfect information, and we relax the assumption that consumers cannot take care. Okay, so when consumers can take care but underestimate losses, neither strict liability with contributory negligence nor negligence in itself are ideal. What about then if we also relax the assumption that the victim is in fact the consumer of the product? So we were saying before that the person who purchases the bottle or the can, the consumer, is the one who would face the losses from the accident, the 10 cents for the bottles and the 2 cents from the cans. What about then now if it's not them that would be exposed to this risk, but a third party? The victim now, from whatever risk that comes out from the cans or the bottles, is in fact a third party, neither the producer nor the consumer. Okay, so what happens now? Under strict liability, we say strict liability is preferred because the price, which includes the full cost, includes the losses to third parties. So when we price the bottles or price the cans, we will add the costs of the accidents regardless. Why? Because it's the firms here that will have to pay. So it doesn't matter to the firm whether the person that's going to be injured is a third party or the buyer themselves, because they will still have to pay under strict liability. But if it's negligence, then you remember that negligence means that you as the person who buys this product could be found negligent, depending on whether it's in bottles or in cans. So if it's in cans, you knew that before it was actually the consumer that would be, they would put into their calculation how much factor in the price of the expected cost, rather factor in the expected costs of the accident. But now they are not the ones to face this cost. So under negligence, prices will not reflect losses to third parties, because producers will choose not to be negligent, i.e. they were not going to use the bottles, and consumers will ignore these losses because they are not the ones going to face them. So when they look at the cans, they look at the cans, but they don't add the 2 cents that the expected cost imposes on the person who's going to face the risk, because they believe it's not going to be them that will face the risk, it's going to be a third party. And the most important, of course, question coming out from this discussion is, should we have any product liability rules, or should we opt for a no liability rule given the possibilities that we have in relation to insurance, even with moral hazards? So this is the big question: how much liability rules do you want to have, and how much legislation do you want to have in relation to product liability, and whether these actually are of much use to us given the analysis that we've been through, or should we opt instead for something like a no liability rule, so remove all of this legislation and rely completely on the mechanism of insurance and the market for insurance? So this is an open, of course, ended question, and it's something that you could probably even discuss among yourselves on the side desk, or at least as food for thought for future possibilities. And I will leave it there, and I'll be talking to you again soon.